Hello everyone, this is Poohhead189, and today we're tackling a huge and controversial subject. Today we're going to be talking about imperialism and colonization in the game Skyrim. Now, Bethesda has really made a true achievement, whether it was intentional or not. I know dozens upon dozens of people, both online and offline, who are adamantly against imperialism, who think any sort of colonization is bad, who believe that any subjugation of peoples can be traced back to pure malevolence or greed, but then they say, without irony, that the Imperials are correct in the Skyrim Civil War, a united empire is best for everyone, and the displaced or persecuted Nords should suck it up for the greater good. And this can really only mean one of two things. Either there is some extreme cognitive dissonance going on with a large part of the fanbase, or these people have to admit that they perhaps don't think imperialism is always so bad. And so let's explore this topic. Let's see if they are right, or at least if there really is a lack of consistency in values. Now, I want to state that this video is not pro-Stormcloak. In fact, later on I will speak on some Stormcloak imperialism, although of course most imperialism will be from the Empire. If I was to make a video on nativism, I would make it predominantly about the Stormcloaks. However, this is going to be about imperialism, so this is based on the Empire. However, this video is examining the benefits and grievances concerning the Empire's presence, and we're also looking at other aspects of colonization and imperialism, even with the Nords and the Thalmor. Now, for many centuries, Skyrim has been Cyrodiil's strongest and most loyal vassal state, with the possible exception of High Rock. Typically, it's said that other than native Cyrodiilic men, Nords are the majority of Imperial military recruits, and both Cyrodiil and Skyrim have a shared history with Talos, otherwise known as Tiber Septim. He restored the Cyrodiilic Empire, yet it is said he was a Nord, even in Atmoran, before his rise to power. However, before we begin, let's describe imperialism. Imperialism is a state policy, practice, or advocacy of extending power and dominion, especially by direct territorial acquisition or by gaining political and economic control of other areas. Because it always involves the use of power, whether military or economic or some subtler form, in nature, imperialism has often been considered morally reprehensible. Now, as stated, Skyrim has been a subject state of the Empire for centuries, even during the volatile and unmistakable changes that occurred between dynasties. Something that people need to understand is that the current Mede Empire is not the same as the Alessian Empire, or the Riemann Empire, or even the Septim Empire. They have different policies, bureaucracies, military institutions, traditions. Comparing the Septim Empire of Oblivion with the crumbling and decadent Mede Empire of the Fourth Era in Skyrim is like comparing the People's Republic of China to the Song Dynasty, or the modern Japanese government to the Tokugawa shogunate. They might be the same ethnicity, have the same or similar language, and a few similar traditions and philosophies, but completely different in every other aspect. The only other aspect they seem to have in common is subjugating other provinces and races through either conquest, manipulation, or intimidation. In fact, it shows just how far the Empire has fallen from both strength and morality that Skyrim, of all provinces, is on the brink of seceding. Yet again, other than potentially High Rock, it's the most loyal faction on Tamriel to the Empire. Now, the main aspect of Skyrim imperialism is threefold. Firstly, a large presence of foreign imperial troops to, quote, maintain order and quell the rebellion of the Stormcloaks. Secondly, a large presence of Thalmor troops, abetted by the Empire, to survey, arrest, and even torture imperial citizens. And thirdly, of course, is the slow cultural genocide of Nordic culture and the overt cultural genocide of religious persecution. Now, the slow cultural genocide has been occurring for centuries. You can't exactly blame the current Mede Empire for that, but it's still the Cyrodiilics. In fact, one way to tell that the Nord culture is changing is that really, for the longest time, Sjor should be the main god that the Nords worry about, but in Skyrim, they are most worried about Talos worship, which is a nominally imperial god. And in fact, something that shows that the Empire has fallen very far is the fact that someone like General Tullius thinks that Talos, who is an imperial god, is just nonsense. However, to go back to Skyrim's loyalty, while Skyrim has been a willing subject kingdom of the Empire for most of the 3rd and 4th eras, in the 2nd Empire under the Riemann dynasty, it was extremely rebellious and resented the Empire for its tight hold over its sovereignty, even though Riemann was arguably the most lax in terms of policy, allowing the various provinces to keep their traditions for the most part, even though Riemann did try to brutally conquer Blackmarsh at the point of a sword, and kept Skyrim under his heel with the same policy. The Nords have always been an extremely proud people, and only Talos, called Tiber Septim in the Imperial way, has kept Skyrim and Cyrodiil as staunch allies during and after the 3rd era. And in fact, it was the Septim Empire's religious freedoms that seemed to be one of the most favorable parts of its reign. It even allowed the limited worship of Daedra, even if such things were looked down on socially. This is why, in Oblivion, Daedric shrines can often be found somewhat close to large trade roads, whereas in Skyrim, they're often found atop craggy mountains or deep in the wilderness. And this gets us to touch on a topic on imperialism. Is imperialism right if, after subjugating a population and a nation, you then change laws to be more egalitarian? Let's say, is women's education worth the slaughter of native inhabitants? Or is child marriage laws worth that and bringing up the age of consent? Or is religious freedom worth that? Well, that's a difficult question to answer, and it's hard to say. I will say that Riemann, and particularly Tiber Septim, did give some benefits to its subject peoples, even if some did resent him for it. Although that is also a double-edged sword, because in Tiber Septim's time, and I think in other eras as well, Tiber Septim allowed the Dunmer to keep their slaves as long as they paid taxes to the Empire, which also shows that at the end of the day, the Empire mostly cares about its coffers and what can benefit them rather than what would be best for all. However, we will get more into that later. To get back to the video at hand, people often don't understand the meaning of Talos worship being forbidden. Firstly, it is seen as weakness by both the Thalmor and the imperial vassal states. There's often an argument that the best way to defeat the Thalmor is for a united empire, and that the empire was too weak to continue the war. However, the Thalmor were also in dire straits. They had lost all of their gains, they could not hold Cyrodiil or Hammerfell, even when Hammerfell fought alone, and are back to square one. However, the fact Mede capitulated rather than continue to fight like the Redguards showed weakness. Secondly, Talos is a symbol of not only the Empire, but of the potential divinity of man. The elves believe they are special, and descendants of the Aedra. However, Talos, along with the Septim line forging a pact with Akatosh, proves humans have the same rights in the metaphysical universe as the Thalmor, who resent that. Thirdly, Talos being the symbol of the Empire itself is also a symbol of Imperial and Nord cooperation. Without him, the link between Cyrodiil and Skyrim is gone, and while most empires in history use infrastructure, stability, and freedom to the peoples they have subjugated as a justification, the Empire has proven it cannot provide for its vassals in the 4th era, and so instead of there being a mutually beneficial relationship, it now seems like the Empire is just a leech, and it needs Skyrim far more than Skyrim needs it, and it takes what it wants by the point of a sword, as it always has, And this brings us to General Tullius. It's stated, by the general himself no less, that he is the one they call for if you simply need to cow a population. If you need something done, no questions asked. He's not there to mediate or negotiate. He's conquest from invincible. He is called to get the job done in record time, and it's clear in his dialogue. People often spout how xenophobic and racist Ulfrich is, and don't worry, we'll get to him. However, Ulfrich never utters a single word about anyone save the elves who tortured him and lied to him during the torment, except for one quote when he is approached about the Dark Elves being unhappy in the Grey Quarter, and he says he needs to worry about that later, he has a war to fight. That's the only thing there is. General Tullius, however, seems to have a casual contempt, even disdain for Nords and their culture. He has many quotes that can easily be described as racist. Tullius says, "Without us to keep the order, the provinces would fall into barbarism and lawlessness, especially Skyrim." Tullius will say, "You people and your damn jarls." He'll also say, "Well, Ulfrich, you can't escape from me this time. Any last requests before I send you to wherever you people go when you die?" He is simply there to subjugate and kill, and even he admits it. And despite his undying loyalty to the Empire, during the famous Elenwen Party quest, he quietly concedes that a lot of what Ulfrich is complaining about is correct. That the Empire is corrupt and failing and perhaps even cruel. The Stormcloaks have no torture chambers. The Empire, however, does, both in Castle Dour and in Helgen, where you begin the game. In fact, it's no small thing that you begin the entire game from the Stormcloak point of view. It shows you how the Empire is a soulless machine, watched over by the Thalmor. Ralof says the Imperial walls used to make him feel so safe, but his eyes are open now. And to prove his point, when you step off the prison cart, your name is not on the list, and yet they will execute you anyway, without trial or knowledge of your alleged crime. Much like the Roman Empire, or the British Empire, or the Spanish Empire, freedom and liberty come second, perhaps even third, to stability and compliance. No small amount of people today will label it as a fascist regime, and for good reason. It takes but does not give. It betrays and does not apologize. If you speak up, you will be reprimanded or killed. Now this leads me to Ulfrich Stormcloak. Whether you think he's a hero or a villain, there's no argument that he is a flawed figure in some ways, of course he is. However, his flaws and his rebellion was unambiguously and indisputably a direct causation of the uncaring imperial bureaucratic machine. Ulfrich, like many Stormcloaks and Nords, was once a staunch defender and believer in the Empire. He bled on the battlefield for Titus Mede, watched fellow Nords die in defense of Cyrodiil, a nation not of his own, for loyalty. He was captured and tortured relentlessly, eventually broken and made to reveal secrets he thought led to the capture of the Imperial City. He was racked with guilt. Even after spilling his own blood and watching his countrymen die for an overlord, and even after extensive torture, he felt like he himself had sinned. And again, this is not to defend Ulfrich. However, everything he has done has been in response to an empire that has betrayed and disenfranchised himself and his people, at least to some degree. Not to mention, the White Gold Concordant proved his point beyond a doubt. People often say because the Empire was weak, they needed to sign the Concordant. That is not true, that's horseshit. The Empire was not weak, Cyrodiil was weak. Hammerfell, High Rock, and Skyrim were fine or out of danger. Cyrodiil decided to give up half of Hammerfell and ban Talos worship because its province was in danger of annihilation and no other. People seem to have no problem with the Empire giving away half of Hammerfell and the Redguards leaving the Empire to fend for themselves. However, it is a problem for Skyrim for reasons unknown. You see, the Empire, through its deeds, is as xenophobic and racist as the Stormcloaks. The difference between them, however, is that while the Stormcloaks want the other races and peoples to leave, at least in an administrative fashion, the Empire wants to make other races and peoples as assets to exploit. They want to use them for their own ends, and while many Imperials would prefer it to be consensual, they will make them do it by force and use them for fodder when push comes to shove, and they have proven it time and again. They're just really good at hiding it. People often cite the Grey Quarter as Stormcloak racism, but whenever you go to another city in Skyrim or Oblivion controlled by the Empire, where are most of the Khajiit and Argonians there? That's right, they're still in the slums. Hell, Imperials even have it as a mechanic in-game with a modifier to speech and mercantilism. They manipulate people. However, now let us get to Stormcloak and even Nordic Imperialism, though I do need to note, the modern Nordic Imperialism is on behalf of the Empire of Cyrodiil, ironically. However, even dismissing that, the Imperialism by the Nords is less overt and damaging than the Imperials' overt stuff, but it's still there. Namely, it's the Reachmen, and specifically, for the Stormcloaks, the Markarth incident. Now, the Reach is a section of land that has been a part of High Rock, Skyrim, and Hammerfell, even being close to Orsimer, for as long as anyone can remember. The Reachmen evidently share a common ancestry with the Bretons, however they are far more mixed when in terms of various peoples, but they were under the hegemony of the Durini Elves. However, they're sort of a mix and match of many managed peoples, like I said. Now, the Reach has switched hands often, however the Nords conquered the Reach during the Interregnum, and it has been in Nord control since, which also means Imperial control. However, during the Great War and the Thalmor invasion, an extremist faction of the Reachmen called the Forsworn invaded Markarth, which is the largest city in the Reach, and conquered it, of course. Now, one could say this was a bit of imperialism on the side of the Forsworn, because they are pretty much a terrorist organization for the Reachmen, right or wrong. However, Hrolfdir and his son Igmund were ousted from power, and then asked Ulfrich Stormcloak and his militia, who would become the Stormcloaks later on, for help. Ulfrich agreed, if Talos worship would be reinstated, having been somewhat radicalized from his torture and imperial betrayal, and would become more so soon. Now Hrolfdir and Igmund agreed to his demands, and Ulfrich retook the city in what is known as the Markarth Incident. Now the Markarth Incident is one of the most contested events prior to Skyrim. On the one hand, you have the Forsworn, who act as terrorists or at least insurgents for the Reachmen, who, we need to remember, don't represent all of the Reachmen, so the Forsworn isn't every Reachman, it's just a radical faction of Reachmen. And they took Markarth when it was weak during the war. Then you have Ulfrich, who retakes it for both his cause and ironically the Empire at that time, for Jarl Hrolfdir was an imperial lord as well as a Nordic one, and the Empire itself wanted Markarth back because at the time Skyrim was purely imperial, and the Forsworn were encroaching on imperial territory. Ironically, this was Stormcloak imperialism on behalf of imperial imperialism, in order for Ulfrich and his people to get more rights under imperial rule. Now, another point of contention is, from the Forsworn testimony, they were treated particularly brutally. Now, according to the Bear of Markarth, Ulfrich and his men killed men, women, and children, and anyone who remained neutral during the conquest and occupation by the Forsworn. Now, there are a few things that don't add up. Firstly, this is clearly a biased work by not only an imperial who dislikes the Stormcloaks, Arianus Arius, but he has only written one other volume where he is a Forsworn sympathizer. And when you go to the Forsworn prisoners in Markarth, they blame the, quote, Jarl there for the atrocities. Now, Ulfrich was never the Jarl there, and in fact, during the Markarth incident, he wasn't even the Jarl of Windhelm. And we know this because after the Markarth incident, Ulfrich was jailed, and then his father died, making him the Jarl of Windhelm. However, the Jarl of Markarth was Hrolfdir, and it stands to reason that after Ulfric's retaking of the city, Hrolfdir wanted to make certain no uprising like that ever happened again, so the Imperial Nord Jarl executed anyone he deemed sympathizers. It's heavily implied, at least, that Hrolfdir's atrocities are blamed on Ulfrich. However, of course, we don't really know that. Ulfrich could have done all that, but that seems to be the case. However, the timelines do get things wrong, oddly enough. Brage, one of the Forsworn in the mines, says that his daughter would have been 23 this year during the game of Skyrim, However, the Reach was retaken in 4th Era 176, 25 years prior to the events of the game. Now, he could have simply lost track of time, but that also begs the question on who exactly to trust, because the Reachmen are innocent, but the Forsworn are radicals, much like the Stormcloaks in a lot of ways. They do things for their ancestral claims because they have been pushed by Imperialism to do so. They have been disenfranchised. Now again, this is not defending Stormcloak nativism or Ulfrich's more hero-complex tendencies or Messiah-complex tendencies. One of the great things about Skyrim Civil War is that both sides have a great point, but the Imperials tend to be seen as the more virtuous of the two, by the fandom at least, when really that's mostly from the bias of having played on the Imperial side for the past string of games, not really seeing how their policies and behind-the-scenes actions really affect and effectively subjugate peoples for their own ends. However, of course, the elephant in the room, the most imperialist faction, or at least the most overtly imperialist faction, is the Aldmeri Dominion, otherwise called the Thalmor. Well, the Thalmor is the ruling party, but you know what I mean. They, over the past decades, have subjugated nearly all elven peoples under their dominion. They frequently show overt racism, and they'll even cull elves like the Bosmer, and even the Khajiit are under their sway. It's hard to believe that they are gentle masters, because while they have an incredible propaganda machine, it stands to reason they are not as good at hiding their goals, and they likely do not even have the enlightened master notions of Cyrodiil's empire. There's really very little to analyze here, save they wish to take all of Tamriel, for they see it as theirs by right. Now, we do have the tower theory, of course, but really, much of their motivations are up to speculation. Anyway, I believe that is everything we have to say today. I suppose I could have delved into the dragons, but I don't see them as a nation, really. Now again, this is not to defend the Stormcloaks. I do think they have plenty of problems, but people do overlook the sins of the Empire, and I think that does a disservice to not only the fandom, but the game itself. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you liked it, please comment and like because that helps the algorithm. Sharing would be super helpful. Subscribe if you want to see more, and all of my links are in the description below. Okay guys, have a great one. See ya!